All right, everybody. Welcome to Double Duty today. This is both covering the Indiana-Illinois Climate Series webinar that Dwayne Friend and I run, as well as the North Central Climate Collaborative webinar that runs every other month. Want to get through some logistics before I introduce our speaker. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the northcentralclimate.org website, as well as the University of Illinois YouTube channel. The snacks, drinks, and restrooms are where you last left them, this being a Zoom call. And you do have the ability to unmute yourself, but we would prefer perhaps using the chat until the end of the talk, at which time we will save some time for questions. I think that covers the necessary details, with the exception of expect to see a very short poll open as soon as Laura's presentation finishes, and we appreciate your filling that out to let us know how we're doing. So
I'm
with
getting
that,
graded?
no, it's two questions. It's just like, did you learn something? Are you going to share it? It's low grade impact numbers. And Cindy, I'll respond to you in the chat once we get started here. So without further ado, Laura Bowling is professor of agronomy at Purdue and will be the department head of agronomy at Purdue on August 1, is it?
August 19th.
August 19th, okay. And have had the pleasure of being a student in Laura's hydrology course when I was at Purdue. So enjoyed you as a person during class and ever since, and really glad to be able to have you speak on water in a changing climate for us today. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Hans. I think we've talked before about when you took the hydrology class. I know it was one of my first years. All I can say is I think it's gotten better. I certainly don't try to pack in quite as much content as I did in those first 2 years. Sort of realized that that wasn't realistic. Well, thank you all for being here today on what I understand is a beautiful summer day. I haven't actually been outside in hours, so I'm not sure myself. I see some familiar names, a lot that I don't recognize. If you're so inclined, if you wouldn't mind typing in the chat, if that's okay with Hans, where you're from, just so I have a little bit of an idea of where my audience is coming from. Webinars are a challenge because I typically rely on either the confused looks or eye rolls to know if I haven't quite made my point or have maybe overmade my point. So since Hans asked us not to use our microphones, maybe if you want to post in the chat if something comes up that you wanted me to clarify, that would be great. So I am a hydrologist in the Department of Agronomy, and I've been here for about 20 years. A colleague of mine told me a few years ago that I needed to stop introducing myself as a hydrologist because a lot of people don't know what that means. So I thought I'd start there, right? So hydrology is the study of water. And so a lot of people might picture something like this for someone who studies hydrology and water resources, standing in a stream and measuring something, maybe collecting water samples. And that does form a large part of what I do. Some of my research certainly involves the field data collection. But as a hydrologist, I'm also interested in understanding all of the interactions of the land surface water cycle, the land surface water budget. And that means that I also need to understand the land surface energy balance, because the two are inherently linked through the process of evapotranspiration, right? That water that is used by crops, by other plants, is the same as the latent heat energy that's part of the energy balance. And so I approach my research from this point of view of land-atmosphere interactions and what humans do to the cycle that disrupts either the energy or the water budget. And I started with this because I'm going to start talking about climate change impacts in Indiana. And so for this reason, it wasn't that strange several years ago when the leaders of the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment came to me and asked me to lead the development of the agricultural impacts chapter as a hydrologist, because I come to my research with this understanding of changes in energy and water and how they interact with the soil vegetation system. And so part of what I want to talk about today is some of my favorite results from the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. I imagine that many of you have seen various presentations on this, right? It's several years old now, but this was an initiative led by Purdue with partners from around the region, looking at the impacts of climate change on different aspects of Indiana's economy and ecosystems. And I believe Melissa Wildhelm was a speaker for this a few months ago. Not sure how much she talked about in CCIA. But like I said, so for my plan for today is to talk about some of the impacts from the agricultural chapter that really stood out to me 5 years later on, the ones that I still find myself going back to. And then that's going to lead into one of my current research projects, looking at climate adaptation in our corn and soybean agricultural system here in Indiana. So although corn and soybeans certainly are the most visible aspect of agriculture in Indiana and in Illinois, with by far the largest amount of the land area, when talking about our ag impacts, I always start with this slide to sort of talk about there's a lot more to Indiana agriculture. We've got ducks and turkeys and hogs and blueberries. And so when we're talking about climate change impacts to agriculture, we're not talking just about our annual crops, but also perennial crops and impacts to animals. And that's why the working group that helped to put together the ag impact study came from multiple different disciplines, and we're working together to holistically look at impacts of climate change on agriculture. All right, so I'm going to jump right in. So obviously we know that temperatures are getting warmer. And they're getting warmer across all of our seasons. But one of our big goals when tackling the agricultural impacts is that we really wanted to move beyond vague statements of changes in mean precipitation and mean temperature, and to really try to hone in and quantify metrics that matter to those who need to make decisions in their operations. And so when we talk about warming temperatures, one way that that can be seen and felt by producers is the average date when the soil temperature reaches 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's often a threshold that can be used to say that the soil is ready for planting. This graph is looking historically since 1984 on the day of the year when soil temperature first rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is based on model simulations. Now this one is observations, it's historic. Right, and so there's a moving average. You can see that it's potentially going a little bit down, showing that we're moving to an earlier day of the year. We then use climate projections. So using output from global climate models that were then used as impact or input to a land surface water and energy balance model so that we can predict things like soil temperature and soil moisture into the future. And so using those model simulations for all across Indiana, we then pulled out results for different sectors of Indiana. And so for West Central Indiana, that climate district, we find that the average date when soil temperature reaches 50 degrees Fahrenheit, my animation isn't working. There we go. Is predicted to move earlier by over 3 weeks by mid-century, right? So that we can have soils warm enough to plant by early February. In theory, of course, I'm a hydrologist, so let's not forget about the water. That doesn't necessarily mean that planting is going to occur that much earlier as we move forward. So let's think about that a little bit more. We know that Indiana is getting wetter. Over the last century, annual precipitation has increased by over 10%, so 5.6 inches, and it's projected to increase more, 6 to 8%, another 6 to 8% by mid-century. This is also not occurring evenly distributed throughout the year, right? So winter and spring are where we're seeing the majority of this precipitation increase. So more of the precipitation is falling as rain, and then that leads to the issue of increased early season soil saturation. So we've got wetter soils. One way that we can sort of, that we try to quantify this impact is by looking at days suitable for field work. So days suitable for field work, it's something that's tracked by the USDA, by crop reporting districts. So for each month, they'll say how many days were suitable for field work based on moisture conditions and rain conditions. This graph is showing our attempt to simulate days suitable for field work. So we were using model simulations of soil moisture in order to predict whether or not field access was going to be possible on a given day. And so these scatter plots I'm using to show you that based on our model, we think that we were able to come up with a pretty good estimate of how many days were suitable for field work historically. And so then we use that with our future simulations to see how this would change. And it's kind of a mess. So this is a box plot, and it's showing the different colors of green are two different emission scenarios. I didn't go over all of the details of how we did our future climate projections and what emission scenarios we used. So I'm assuming some level of familiarity with the study. Certainly can answer questions about that at the end if you would like. But the RCP 4.5 was the lower emission scenario, 8.5 is the higher. And then we looked at 3 future time periods. And so most of my results I've been showing are for this mid-century, the 2041 to 2070. This box plot is showing the difference in the days suitable for field work in the spring relative to a historic time period, right? And one of the first things I think you'll notice is that these boxes have really, really, really long whiskers, showing that the answer is all over the place. So that in some years, we have a positive difference, meaning that you would have a lot more days in the spring when you can get in the field because it's really dry. And then in other years, you have a lot fewer days where you can get in the field because it's really wet. The black line in the middle of the boxes is showing the mean. So on average, there's a slight decrease, right, with fewer working days. But I really think the take-home message here is that you can't rely on earlier warming alone to determine planting, and it's going to be highly variable. And so that there's no clear indication that we'll be planting significantly earlier in the future. Of course, one of the ways that we manage that excess moisture in the winter and spring in Indiana is through the use of subsurface drainage. And so wetter spring conditions mean that we're going to have an increase in subsurface drainage volume. So once again, this is model predictions looking at, in the middle of Indiana, an increase of 29 to 47% in the volume of subsurface drainage water that we have in the spring. And so that, of course, has implication, one, for our drainage infrastructure, potentially motivating people to intensify their drainage, put drains closer together, which certainly has implications for our county infrastructure that's receiving all of that drainage water, and potentially for flooding downstream. It also has important implications for water quality because it's that spring nitrate load from subsurface drainage that's so important to hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. But before I come back to water, we're going to talk a little bit more about warming temperatures. Certainly, warming temperatures can also extend our growing season on the back end. So this graph is showing historically, so based on observations, the date of the first killing frost. So the first hard freeze below 25 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're just looking visually, showing that that Julian day, the day of the year, is getting bigger, meaning it's pushing back later in the year. So doing the same thing, using our model projections to then look at how that changes by mid-century, we're seeing that that date of the first hard freeze is moving back 10 to 12 days, right? So that staying warmer a little bit longer. This can have the biggest implications for our perennial crops, our crops that require a dormancy period to overwinter and that controls bud break in the spring. So one of the tools that we can use to try to understand those dormancy requirements of perennial vegetation is the concept of chilling hours. So the accumulation of hours that are above freezing, but are still cool. And so different metrics use different threshold, but we're looking at temperatures sort of 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this plot showing all of our different scenarios. So the biggest map of Indiana is showing historically the number of chilling hours accumulated in a year, starting from that first hard freeze and then counting all winter. And then we're looking for 3 different future time periods in columns, and then low emission scenario and high emission scenario in the rows. So overall, this is showing that in the most extreme scenario, sort of this lower right-hand corner, a pretty substantial reduction in the number of chilling hours that we will accumulate over winter by the end of the century. And that can have important implications for some fruit crops that are currently grown in Indiana that have higher chilling hour requirements, that those crops might not be viable any longer. But this issue of dormancy and chilling hours is even more complex when we look in the short term. So in the long term, we're looking at a reduction in chilling hours. But in the shorter term, it's actually the reverse story. So these maps have kind of horrible colors and they're difficult to understand, but bear with me because I think it's an interesting point. So this is looking at the day of the year when we would accumulate 1,000 chilling hours on average. And 1,000 was just sort of a medium value that would be typical of some fruit crops. And so during our historic period from 1981 to 2010, on average, across Indiana, we would accumulate 1,000 chilling hours between about March 22nd and April 5th. Looking at the mid-century projections, we see more of that pink and red, showing that the date by which we accumulate those chilling hours is actually moving forward in time, right? So long-term, we're not accumulating as many chilling hours, but short-term, we're actually accumulating them faster because in the winter, we're spending more time just above freezing and less time below freezing. And so this is important for signaling for some of our crops when they are going to break dormancy. And so it can lead to earlier bud break, right? Crops that are flowering earlier in the spring because they already accumulated their chilling hours, but yet it's not past danger of a hard frost. And so then we have that bad situation where our fruit crops have already flowered and then they encounter a freeze. All right, so now we've sort of moved through the winter. We're going back into the growing season. Certainly another important aspect of climate change in Indiana is the heat stress, and that's going to be a problem for both livestock and crops. So one way that we can look at that is the duration of heat stress. And so here we used a threshold of 86 degrees Fahrenheit as a value when some livestock might be experiencing stress. Looking in the mid part of the state, historically, the average duration of one of those heat spells would be about 3 days, right? So the livestock had to get through that 3-day period of stress where they're eating less and not gaining weight, and then temperatures were cooled down. But by the mid-century, we're looking at 6 to 7 days of duration. So a substantially longer time that we need to manage those heat stress conditions. This is obviously not my area of expertise, but I just wanted to point out that in the years since we first did this assessment, this is an area where many faculty at Purdue have actually done a substantial amount of work. So this picture is showing Dr. Swally with his cooling pad that has been recently patented. So that is used in hog operations so that they can maintain cooler body temperatures. And then a group of colleagues have recently released the Hot Hog app. And so this app is meant to provide better warnings of conditions when livestock might be well, pigs in particular, might be experiencing heat stress. And so that app is available for download for free. So maybe a topic that might be of interest to this group in the future would be some of those livestock adaptation mechanisms. So crops are the other thing that are experiencing heat stress. This illustration is showing in particular, based on historic data, that high nighttime temperatures can be a particular problem, especially sort of July nighttime temperatures or high temperatures coinciding with pollination. I think you had Jeff Valenick as a recent speaker. My guess is that he might have brought up a graph similar to this, because this is certainly based on his work and a topic that is of great interest to him. We did do crop model simulations as part of our impact assessment for corn, soybean, and wheat. And so what I'm showing here are some of those simulated results. Full disclosure here, our crop simulations of course used sort of a consistent hybrid, right? The models aren't so good at representing different hybrids, so we sort of simulate the same corn and soybean under future climate conditions. And in my first few presentations, I got a lot of pushback that people were not happy to not see the historic yield trend reflected in our numbers. Right? They said, well, keeping the same technology into the future isn't realistic, because we've had a very dramatic trend in yields over the last few decades because of technology improvements. And so what I've done here is you can see that as we go forward in time, the simulated corn yield is going up, and the height of those bars represent yield potential. So where we're taking the historic trend in yields and putting it back into the results. So the assumption is that through technological improvements, changes in seed and breeding, that we will continue to have higher yield potentials in the future. But then the blue bars are showing where we're not achieving yield potential according to model simulations because of increasing heat and drought stress. And so these results are showing for corn, showing a greater reduction relative to yield potential in the future. So then we also did simulations with irrigation, so we can see that certainly irrigation can help to recover some of that yield loss, and that the potential yield gain as a percentage going into the future increases, right? That irrigation looks better the further we go, which makes sense, right? The drier it gets, the hotter it gets, the more that we would like irrigation. So we also did economic analysis relative to that. And this is where the fact that it's a few years old is definitely going to impact our bottom line, because we used current prices at the time. So economic analysis is going to depend very much on commodity prices. But we did find that, sort of looking broad scale, that even though irrigation becomes more and more attractive from a yield standpoint going forward in time, at the current commodity prices, the increased income was not enough to offset the cost of investment in irrigation systems, right? So put in more economic terms, the net present value of the difference between investing in irrigation and farming without irrigation remains negative. Certainly for individual operations, lots of people are investing in irrigation, and oftentimes there is something that adds value to the proposition. Maybe it's a seed contract or something like that that is different than the conditions that we assumed for this analysis. All right, so that was mostly my overview, my quick walk through the climate change impacts assessment. So I want to come back to this idea of drainage and high temperatures. So we just told you that irrigation looks increasingly attractive to our corn and soybean crops the more we go into the future, but doesn't really pay for itself. We also know that we have this increasing volume of spring drainage water that has negative implications for water quality in the state and for flooding downstream. And so that leads us to think about conservation practices that can help with both drainage water management as well as potentially dealing with that increased crop stress. And so one practice that comes to mind is this idea of drainage water recycling. So drainage water recycling is the practice of capturing excess water that's drained from your crop fields, usually from subsurface drains, could be from surface drainage as well. We store that drained water, and then we use the water to irrigate crops later in the growing season, right? So helping with our water quality problem on the front end and our crop stress on the back end. And so one of the questions that my colleagues and I have been working on is drainage water recycling the solution? I can save you a lot of time. I'll tell you right now, the answer is no. And that's because I already told you irrigation doesn't pay for itself, and this is an expensive form of irrigation because it generally requires excavating a storage reservoir on farm so you have a place to store that water, and then you still need the irrigation infrastructure in order to apply that water to the field. So I'd say the more accurate question that we're exploring here at Purdue is, could it be? So we are trying to look for ways that, one, we can reduce the cost of drainage water recycling, at least for small scale systems, and increase the value of irrigation so that we can maybe come up with a version of this practice that might pay for itself and might be a possible win-win for both water quality and climate adaptation. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about the crazy experiment that we have been running at the agronomy farm. So the Agronomy Center for Research and Education that's out on US 52 in West Lafayette. So for those of you who have been to the Beck Center or the agronomy farm, so we've got an aerial image of most of the farm. You enter down here with the tree-lined drive. And over here in what used to be the southwest corner of the farm, it's now expanded to the west, there's this woodlot, right? An area that has always been there. Most of it has been part of the farm property for decades, but it has never been farmed. Some of you, if you're from the area, might remember that there used to be the Oaks Inn in this parking lot right on US 52. It was before my time. I understand they had good prime rib on Sundays. But so this is what happens when you let a hydrologist play at your agronomy farm. I have been playing in this wetland, in this woodland, where it already receives subsurface drainage water from about 175 acres of the farm. So the green lines to the right are all the subsurface drain lines that come into this blue wetland through 2 inlet channels. So we have started managing water level in that wetland so that we can store it throughout the growing season. And then we pump water over here to the west on field 70, where we're irrigating corn and soybeans through drip irrigation. So some of the things that we're trying to do with this research project, first I said that we're trying to add value to the irrigation itself. And so we're evaluating the benefits of intensive management with drip fertigation. So we're trying to use as little water as possible, so we don't need as big of a storage reservoir. And we're adding fertilizer to our drip irrigation so that we're getting a little bit more value with every application. We are also trying to support this impaired wetland ecosystem. And so at the end, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think we're doing to improve the wetland. We are monitoring our overall water quality and quantity benefits, both in field and sort of downstream, looking at the outlet of the wetland, evaluating the economic feasibility of the practices, and hopefully advancing knowledge. All right, so here are some of the pieces and parts that go with this small scale irrigation system. So I'm actually going to start here in the lower right-hand corner. So this wetland is a natural wetland. It has hydric soil. It's existed as far back as I can find on aerial images, but it does have an excavated outlet that was dug probably about 50 years ago. And so it has an artificial outlet channel. We have built this control structure in the outlet channel, and it has flashboards or risers, so we can move boards up and down to control the water level in the wetland. This is a jurisdictional wetland, and so we have permits from IDEM and the Army Corps of Engineers that allows us to control the water level in the wetland. We have a pump, this little pump is what we use to pump water from the wetland. It goes through this double filter system and off to the field, and that's powered with a gas generator. In the field, we have two main lines because we have both irrigation and fertigation, but this image is showing where the fertilizer is being injected directly into the irrigation line. So that's how we do fertigation, right? We just pre-mix the fertilizer or whatever amendments are being added and then inject them directly into the line. And we have soil moisture probes that are monitoring our soil moisture content down to 24 inches in each of our treatments. For anyone who is familiar with or interested in drip irrigation, we're using Netafim materials on a 30-inch spacing for our drip irrigation. So we actually completed 3 years with surface drip irrigation, 2021 through 2023. And this year we are moving to subsurface drip, or we have moved. We just haven't done our first irrigation application of the year yet. So the bottom photo is showing the 2-inch PVC main for the subsurface system. And there are these black risers that are connecting to the drip line that is buried 12 to 14 inches below the surface. And of the numbers over here, I'll just point out the application rate works out to be about 0.045 inches per hour. So that's, I mean, that's the thing with drip irrigation, is that we are just spooning the water on. So it's just getting a very low rate of water application each time we irrigate. So just a little bit about how we operate the system. So the first part of operation is managing our wetland water level. So the graph at the bottom is just showing the number of boards in place. And so basically we're watching our fields and our subsurface drainage throughout April. And as the spring storms start to slow down, that's when we're going to put our boards in place so that we can start storing water. And then for that first month, we really need to watch it carefully, because it is possible that we can still get a really large rain event that has the potential of backing up water in our drainage system and flooding our fields. And so if we get one of those really big rain events, we're going to go and lower the boards so that we can drain the fields more rapidly, and then we'll put the boards back in place so that we can capture the end of that drainage. And then at the end of the growing season, we remove all of the boards so that we have a free-flowing system. And this is part of our permit agreement, that we are trying to mimic the natural hydro period of the wetland as much as possible. So I mentioned that we are using soil moisture sensors in each of our treatments. And these Dragino soil moisture sensors, I think it's Dragino is the antenna, it actually communicates in real time with the LoRaWAN network that we have out at Acre. And so we're able to get soil moisture in real time on the internet. And so I'm just showing you 2 screenshots. We get soil moisture at 4 different depths. So 15-centimeter intervals, or 6 inches, down to 60 centimeters or 24 inches. And so you can see for the same time period that we irrigated corn twice during this time period. In the rain-fed treatment, there's no response because it did not receive any water. And the blue line here is showing the surface most sensor, so you can see the decline in soil moisture in the rain-fed plot. So in terms of how we're operating our irrigation, certainly, you know, there's decades and decades, if not centuries, of research on irrigation and irrigation management and deficit irrigation. But most of those tools have been developed and used in areas west of here, where the soils are not poorly drained. So we are using existing technologies, but finding that we need to adjust things a little bit because we are irrigating a poorly drained soil with subsurface drainage. In particular, I think it means that sort of capillary rise and upward flux is a bigger component of our water balance than it might be in other locations. So we do use both a traditional checkbook scheduler, sort of that calculated water balance each day, and our soil moisture sensor simultaneously in order to decide when to irrigate. So our threshold is a soil moisture deficit of 30% for both corn and soybeans. We irrigate them separately, but we use the same threshold for both crops. And so we are updating both our deficit calculations every morning, and we make a decision by 8 a.m. each day whether or not we are going to irrigate on that day. When we do irrigate, we're doing it just for ET replacement. So remember, we're only putting it on less than 0.05 inches per hour, 0.045. And so we are irrigating for something like 4 hours or 5 hours in that day in order to replace the ET that's being lost that day. Then we'll check the deficit again the next morning, and we'll irrigate again that next afternoon if it is still low. All right, so we're not building up soil moisture and then waiting 5 days. We irrigate every day if necessary. So for this first iteration of our experiment, we have 6 treatments. So we're basically comparing standard management with intense management for both corn and soybeans. And then for those 2 management options, we have rain-fed, irrigated, or fertigated. And this, don't worry too much about the brightly colored squares, but that's our current plot layout. So we are able, with our new subsurface system that's just been installed, we basically have 24 different zones that we're managing. This is a lot of information, and I don't know how many agronomists I have on the call, but I'm sure that there's some people who are interested in knowing what the difference between standard and intensive management is. It mostly has to do with additional applications of fungicide, nitrogen, and sulfur, and the timing of those applications. For corn, the intensive management scenario also has a higher seeding rate. And then the final column is also showing the fertigation treatments. And so certainly with fertigation, it allows us to apply nitrogen and sulfur more times in the growing season at later crop stages when they might be able to make better use of those nutrients. An additional benefit is that they're getting those nutrients together with water. And so I think part of the signal we're seeing is that they're better able to make use of those additional late season nutrients. For the corn treatments, all of the treatments are receiving the same total amount of N. They're just receiving it at different times. For the soybeans, there are some differences where the intensive treatment is receiving extra nitrogen and the standard treatment doesn't receive any. All right. Looks like I'm getting close on time. This is just to give you a picture of, in case anyone's curious, of sort of when do we irrigate, how much do we irrigate. So 2022 on top, 2023 on the bottom. The top axis is showing the precipitation. Certainly precipitation comes in much larger amounts than our irrigation, which are these tiny little blips along the bottom. We irrigate soybean much later in the growing season. We don't start irrigating soybean, which are the orange lines, until R3, where we start corn irrigation at about V10. Between 2022 and 2023, there wasn't a huge difference in growing season precipitation. And in this case, that's May 1st through September 30th. But we had about double the amount of irrigation in 2023. And that largely comes down to the timing of precipitation. So you can see that a little bit better looking at cumulative rainfall between the 2 years. 2023, you might remember last year started out very dry. So we started irrigating much earlier by about mid-June. And then it was pretty wet there for a while at the end of July. And then it dried out again. And so pretty much all of our soybean irrigation happened out here at the end of August and into September during the pod fill period. And so that's really where we doubled our amount of irrigation, was in that dry spell later in the growing season. So just a little bit of corn results. Here's a picture from Dan Quinn. He's the corn agronomist on the project, showing the difference between the fertigation ears and the rain-fed ears that have that much greater pullback, if I got my terminology correct. So I'm only going to show you one of these because I've probably already made you look at too many box plots today. But this is showing corn yield results from the last growing season, from 2023. In bushels per acre. So the black numbers are showing the average yield in bushels per acre. And going right to left, this pink block is our standard management rain-fed agriculture. Right? And then we move across to standard with irrigation, standard with fertigation, intensive management rain-fed. You can see it has a much greater variability. Intensive management with irrigation, and intensive management with fertigation. In terms of statistical significance, all of the treatments none of them were statistically different from each other, but all of them were statistically higher than standard management rain-fed. So in both years, our irrigated treatment, our fertigated treatment, and our intensive management significantly increased corn yield compared to standard rain-fed management. Across both years, both crops, corn and soybean, intensive management with fertigation had the highest yield in each year, but it wasn't statistically significant. But the mean yield does come out highest for that most intensive treatment. So a couple of thoughts on that. So I'll go back to my next slide, thinking a little bit about in-season nutrient use and nutrient use efficiency. We still need to do a lot of work in quantifying all of the data that we have. And so I have just a little snapshot of in-field nutrient loss from 2022. So we've struggled with our suction cup lysimeters, but we're trying to take pore water samples to see if there are differences in leaching between these different treatments. And so what we saw with the corn crop in particular is this green bar is showing really high concentrations across all the three things measured, nitrate, phosphate, and sulfate, with the intensive management treatment. And then when we coupled intensive management with irrigation or fertigation, we were not seeing those high concentrations. When we look to soybeans, we also don't consistently see the highest concentration with intensive management, but sometimes we do. So we think this is where it really has to do with moisture availability, that that corn was receiving those additional intensive management applications earlier in the growing season when it was dry. And so we think in the intensive management treatment, the crop wasn't able to make use of those extra nutrients. And so it did lead to these high concentrations in the pore water during the next rainfall event, when we did get pore water. But when we had intensive management coupled with irrigation, there was water available. And so the crops were better able to make use of those nutrients. And when we did intensive management with soybean, it was also later in the growing season when there was more moisture available. So we didn't see that same increase. So certainly we have more work to do to see if that signal is repeated in additional years. So in terms of the agronomic results from this experiment, what we see so far is that for both corn and soybean, intensive management with in-season fertigation is producing the highest grain yield. In terms of low input management systems, right, standard management, drip irrigation using recycled drainage water provided the greatest yield increase. And we really still need to dig more into our additional data to assess the plant nutrient uptake and use efficiency, because we really think that that's where fertigation is sort of rising above that it's not substantially greater, significantly greater in yield, but from an environmental point of view, that it's giving us additional benefits. Okay, I need to stop talking, but I'm a hydrologist, so I have to talk a little bit about the wetland because that's part of our system and our ecosystem benefits. We've actually been monitoring this wetland since 2007 before we started managing it. So we already know that the wetland itself is very effective at reducing nitrate, even without water level management, just under natural conditions, that we get about a 28% nitrate concentration reduction, about the same amount of load. When we look at the nutrients that are applied to the crops from the wetland, that's always an important question. We are monitoring the quality of that water that we're using for irrigation, but it ends up being a really, really small mass, right? So notice that this vertical axis is in grams, and the only number that even shows up on the axis is sulfate, which is still a mystery to us. So in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, you would never reduce your fertilizer recommendations for the field based on the mass of nutrients that's coming from the stored water. It's just not that much. And so this is the direct load reduction we see downstream from irrigation, but it's not really the whole story. So for better or for worse, the majority of the water that we store in the wetland never goes to the field, but it's also not going downstream. So that's this wetland water balance. So this is from 2022. So the horizontal axis is sort of a time axis if you follow along from the left to right. So when our wetland is all full up, it's a pretty small system. We have about 3,300 cubic meters of water. It's about 3 acre-feet. Moving to the next bar, the height of this blue bar is the volume of water that was applied in irrigation in 2022, right? So maybe a quarter of the stored water made it to irrigation. Story's a little bit different in 2023 because we actually refilled the wetland mid-season and then had more irrigation. The next blue bar are the evaporation losses. So the majority of the stored water is going to ET. We've got this healthy reed canary grass that's just pumping water out to the atmosphere. So it's still a water quality benefit, perhaps. So that's water that's not going downstream, but it's not going to the crops. And then we've estimated seepage losses based on our observations. The last piece of the puzzle is thinking a little bit about wetland habitat. We know, because we've been out there since 2007, that this wetland is already home to some amphibians and crustaceans. We've got some crawdads out there. One way that we can think about habitat is in terms of the hydro period, right? The portion of a year that a wetland holds water, or maybe that it holds water above some defined threshold. And disturbance regimes often lead to disruptions to a wetland's hydro period, either making it very short or very long, so it becomes more of a lake environment. And we know from previous research that have been done by my colleagues in Forestry and Natural Resources that many amphibians need the wetland hydro period to extend into mid-July for reproductive success. And so we were trying to look at if we're having an impact on that. Oh, I forgot. These are our spring peepers. So we've got lots of spring peepers out there. So this is one way that we've been trying to quantify that impact on hydro period. So the blue line on these two images is the jurisdictional boundary of the wetland. So that's what was mapped based on soil and vegetation and is part of our permit. The left-hand map is showing historically, based on our water level measurements, the percent of time that water is at or above the surface for different parts of this wetland. So you can see that over the last 14 years, a substantial portion of this jurisdictional wetland was never flooded, right? Because of the excavated outlet channel. In contrast, in 2022, when we were managing water in the wetland, we were able to have water above the surface for at least a portion of the growing season for the full extent of the jurisdictional wetland. So we feel that we are actually, through this management, returning the wetland to something closer to natural conditions. And so we don't feel that we're having a negative impact on the habitat conditions in the wetland. All right, so with that, I'll just leave you with some takeaway thoughts. We know that increased heat and water stress are reducing crop yields relative to potential. I didn't really talk about soil health today, but these changes that we've seen are important for both soil health and water quality with increased drain flow. Drainage water recycling has the potential to mitigate the heat and water stress while improving water quality. But we know that in the Eastern Corn Belt, the economics of these incremental benefits are tough, right? We've got some work to do to make this something that a lot of people are going to adopt. We continue to look for ways to reduce costs and increase the benefits. I think small scale distributed systems making use of existing wet spots has potential. And we really want to look holistically at water management across the entire farm, not just one single field at a time. Some of the things that are on our to-do list for our specific project is that we really need to quantify our nutrient use efficiency, our ecosystem benefits, and the economics of the risk reduction. And then an added objective that we didn't have in the beginning is that we really want to explore the impact of soil biology from adding wetland water to our soil environment. Are we changing the biology, and is that a positive or a negative? All right, with that, I will stop talking and see what is on everybody else's mind.
Okay, feel free to unmute yourself or pose your question in the chat. You're getting applause via reaction from a couple of participants here. I'm going to go ahead and post the poll up.
And Hans, I don't know if that, I'm not seeing the chat, and if that's something that you've, like I could see when everyone introduced themselves, but if anyone's posted since then, I'm not seeing it.
Well, there's only been one post that was
Okay.
subsequently deleted. Jennifer, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Great to see your work, and thanks for all the great data slides. It was really awesome. But I have a quick question about the intensive management irrigation fertigation experiment. Those yields, even for your sort of standard control scenario where, I mean, that's exceptionally productive land, 260 bushels per acre was your, sort of low. Do you think that applying this technique in lower quality land or lower, soils that just aren't as good or sort of not marginal, but getting towards marginal would make the benefit of this practice really shine? Or I just wondered if you thought about that. Thanks.
That's a great question. And Dan Quinn will be so excited that you think his yields are really exceptional, because I intentionally showed 2023 yields because he was embarrassed by 2022. So we were pretty happy with our yields in 2023. We've been working closely with Netafim. They were not happy with our yields. They don't think that they're high enough from what they're used to. And so,
yeah, I was just going by like the overall 200-ish for all of Indiana. So it includes a lot of variation, I know, but I get your point about optimization.
And so I don't consider this to be exceptional land. We do have some challenges with the soil, but I think it's still a good question in terms of how well this would do on more marginal soils. And that's just a hypothesis on my part. I think that there would be more benefit, but more challenges, right? As we sort of get into even more poorly drained and higher clay content, then we definitely need to make sure that our tools for irrigation scheduling are representing those conditions correctly, so we don't start over watering.
I've got a follow-up question then. When we started talking about drainage water management, maybe a decade ago now, there were pretty severe limitations on slope of field. Do those still exist for the most part? I think it was around 2% slopes and above were not ideal for drainage water management.
That was specifically if you were doing controlling water in the field using those edge of field control structures, right?
Yes.
So that
Sorry.
you're raising the water table in the field for that sort of passive water storage. And so yeah, you for those structures, you still need a really low slope, or you're just not going to influence very much of the field. Or you need to have a drainage system designed where maybe you're going to have contours or something like where the drains are installed on contours so that you have lower slopes on your drains. For this system, we're not relying on that because we're capturing all of the drainage water separately outside of the field. And so it actually works better on sloping land because, right, I mentioned in the beginning that when we're storing water in the wetland, we have to watch because in our first year, we put all the boards in. I went out of town. We had a really big rain event, and I was getting the department head calling me that you need to get out to acre, you're flooding the fields, right? So if you don't have enough of a slope, enough of an elevation difference between your fields and your water storage reservoir, when the reservoir fills up, you might impede drainage from the fields. I think I'm since convinced them that it was not my fault that we were going to flood regardless, but that was 1 month after we had installed it. It didn't go well.
Okay, are there other questions? This is the last call to fill out the poll if you haven't participated in that yet. Okay, I think I gave it the 7 seconds. Haven't seen anything, so we are right on the end of the hour here. I sure appreciate everyone's attendance, participation. Laura, thank you for presenting. Really excited to see the newer research out there in the field as well. So everyone have a great rest of your day. And thanks once again.
Thank you all so much.